This is Janus Dispatch, Architecture over Narrative, Part 3 of 6 in the State of the Republic series. The One-Way Door, Why the Court Cannot Walk Back. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1963. We have a cancer within, close to the presidency, that's growing. It's growing daily. It's compounding. It grows geometrically now because it compounds itself. John Dean to President Nixon, Oval Office, March 21, 1973. White House tape recording. The Mechanism. Two essays preceded this one. The first, Compound Ignorance, described what a leader who has stopped reading no longer knows. The second, Obedience in Advance, described what the courtiers around him bring before being asked. This essay asks the question that follows from both. Once the courtiers see what they have built, why do they not stop? The standard answer is loyalty. The standard answer is wrong. Loyalty is an emotional category, and the people described in this essay operate in a structural category. They have made decisions that cannot be undone, taken positions that cannot be retracted, signed papers that cannot be unsigned. Each act has a consequence that does not expire when the political moment changes. The acts compound, the consequences accumulate, and eventually every member of the court arrives at a private threshold beyond which the only available strategy is to continue. This is the one-way door. In the language of corporate strategy, a one-way door is a decision that cannot be reversed. The opposite is a two-way door, a choice that can be revisited if conditions change. Most decisions in normal political life are two-way doors. A senator can vote against a bill and later vote for an amended version. A cabinet member can resign and later return to private life with reputation intact. A press secretary can leave one administration and join another. Anthony Scaramucci held the post of White House Communications Director for 11 days in 2017, then left and re-entered public life as a Trump critic, his investment firm intact. The political class has been organized around the assumption that two-way doors are the default and one-way doors are exceptional. What has changed in the current administration is not the existence of one-way doors. They have always existed. What has changed is the proportion. The percentage of decisions that are irreversible has climbed steadily, and the people making those decisions have either failed to notice or have noticed and proceeded anyway. The result is a court whose members, individually rational, find themselves in a collective position that no individual would have chosen. Once enough one-way doors have closed behind a person, retreat is no longer available as an option. The only available trajectories are forward. This is a structural observation, not a moral one. It applies to everyone who reaches this state, regardless of intention or character. The usual fragility comes from the absence of skin in the game, from those who bear no cost when they are wrong. Here, the asymmetry runs the other way. The operators have skin in the game, but only on one side of the bet. They cannot lose by hedging. They can only lose by losing. The thresholds. The doors close in stages, each heavier than the one before. The first threshold is reputational. There is a level of public association with a regime beyond which professional re-entry into mainstream institutions becomes impossible. This is not a moral judgment. It is a market condition. The hedge fund will not hire a former Treasury Secretary who publicly attacked Federal Reserve independence. The university will not appoint a former Defense Secretary who saluted Truth Social posts. The investment bank will not retain a former Fed chair who inverted the Federal Reserve Act. The corporate board will not seat a director whose name has become a liability the brand cannot price. These institutions are themselves capital subject to reputational damage, and they will not absorb risk that did not previously exist. The reputational threshold is the first to be crossed and the easiest to underestimate. The people crossing it tend to assume that the market for their services will normalize when the political weather changes. The historical record suggests this assumption is wrong more often than not. The advisors of the late Romanov court did not return to Russian institutions after 1917. The judges of Vichy did not return to French jurisprudence after 1944. The colonels of the Greek junta did not return to public life after 1974. The cabinet of Marcos did not return to Philippine governance after 1986. The members of regimes that fall ungracefully tend to fall with their regimes. The second threshold is civil legal. Many of the actions performed by an administration produce private causes of action. Others produce administrative or contractual liability. Pending lawsuits target the Kennedy Center renaming, the dismantling of the United States Institute of Peace, the use of federal banners on cabinet department buildings, and the National Park Pass redesign. Each of these suits names individual officials as defendants. The Federal Tort Claims Act provides immunity in some categories of action, but not others. Civil rights actions under Section 1983 of the Federal Code attach personal liability to individual federal officials acting under color of law where constitutional violations are demonstrated. A change of administration does not extinguish these suits. It frequently catalyzes them. The plaintiffs, who have been quiet under one government, become loud under the next, and the discovery process that was politically costly to pursue becomes routine. The third threshold is criminal. This is the smallest category in number of cases, but the largest in personal consequence. Several of the acts performed by senior officials in the current administration are arguably criminal under existing federal statutes if proven beyond reasonable doubt. False statements to federal agencies, obstruction of proceedings, conspiracy against rights, unlawful orders, and the endorsement of unlawful operations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, provisions rarely applied to senior civilians, but not, by statute, restricted from such application. The probability of any individual prosecution remains low. The probability that some prosecutions will occur, given a transition of power and the volume of conduct under examination, approaches 1. Each official in a position of public exposure has a personal probability calculation, and the calculation does not improve by waiting. A person who has crossed only the reputational threshold has lost a career. Cross the civil threshold, and the loss becomes financial security. Cross the criminal one, and it becomes liberty. The operators of the current administration are distributed across the full range, most carrying exposure on more than one front, and some on every front. Case Study 1. Watergate and the Door. 2 men walked through. In March 1973, John Dean, White House counsel to Richard Nixon, age 34, Republican, ambitious, complicit, sat in the Oval Office and told the president there was a cancer close to the presidency that was growing. The phrase was not a flourish. It was an accurate clinical description of a decision tree that had been narrowing for 9 months and was about to close. Dean was not the first member of the Nixon administration to recognize that the cover-up of the Watergate break-in had taken on a logic of its own. He was, however, one of the first to calculate that the cover-up's logic was carrying him toward consequences he was unwilling to bear. Once he made that calculation, he had a narrow window. He could ride the cover-up to its end, and whether he pressed on or went quiet, the prosecutorial spotlight would find him and leave him implicated. Or he could cooperate, while cooperation was still worth something. Dean cooperated. On June 25, 1973, he testified before the Senate Watergate Committee for a full week. He provided the framework that allowed prosecutors to understand which conversations had occurred, in which order, with which participants. The Saturday Night Massacre would not happen for another 4 months, but the ground beneath Nixon was already collapsing, and Dean's testimony was the structural reason. Dean served 4 months in prison. The sentence was reduced from a longer term in recognition of his cooperation. He emerged in 1975, wrote books, gave lectures, and eventually returned to a public life that included television commentary. His career did not look like the career it would have been without Watergate, but he had a career. H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff, served 18 months. John Ehrlichman, Domestic Policy Advisor, served 18 months. John Mitchell, former Attorney General, served 19 months. Charles Colson, Special Counsel, served 7 months. G. Gordon Liddy, who organized the original break-in, served more than 4 years before President Carter commuted his sentence in 1977. Each of these men had been at the center of the Nixon administration's decision-making. Each had crossed the same thresholds Dean had crossed. None of them had done what Dean did at the moment Dean did it. The lesson is structural rather than moral. The window for surrender is narrow. It opens before the prosecutorial framework has been built and closes when the framework is complete. A person who cooperates while the prosecution still needs help has leverage. A person who waits until the prosecution has its case has nothing to offer. The exchange of information for clemency works in only one direction. Information given early is valuable. Information given late is redundant. Surrender is a weapon, but only when it precedes defeat. Surrender after defeat is not surrender. It is capture. In 1973, 4 senior Nixon officials had the same access to the same information. 1 walked through the door. 3 did not. The man who walked through emerged with a reduced sentence and a future. The men who did not walk through served full terms and never recovered politically. None of them was less intelligent than Dean. None of them was less informed. What separated them was the timing of a single calculation about which threshold had already been crossed and which still permitted retreat. The current administration's senior operators have not yet had a Watergate moment. They have, however, accumulated a longer list of irreversible acts than the Nixon administration accumulated over its full duration. The window that was open to Dean in March 1973 is not yet closed for them. But the historical record on such windows is consistent. The people who recognize the window and walk through it are rare. Most do not. Case Study 2. Eichmann and the Identity Bound to Function. In April 1961, Adolf Eichmann sat in a glass booth in Jerusalem and gave testimony that has unsettled every observer since. The man in the booth was responsible for the bureaucratic organization of the deportation of millions of people to extermination camps, a perpetrator of the largest crime in modern history. and yet he did not fit any of the available templates for what such a perpetrator should look like. He was not ideological. He could quote Kant badly and produce no coherent framework for his actions, and he was not sadistic, nor in any meaningful sense a fanatic. The conditions in the extermination camps had disturbed him on the few occasions he visited them. What he was instead was something stranger and more frightening. He was a man whose entire self-conception was bound to a function, and the function had now disappeared, leaving him stranded. The SS Obersturmbannführer, who organized train schedules from Western Europe to Auschwitz, had for 15 years derived his identity, his social standing, his sense of professional accomplishment, and his understanding of his place in the world from the execution of a specific bureaucratic role. When the regime collapsed in 1945, he did not become a different man. He became a man without a function, and he experienced this absence as catastrophe. The result has a name, worn smooth by 60 years of misuse: the banality of evil. The phrase is read to mean that evil is unimpressive. What it actually means is that the persons who execute the operational machinery of evil regimes are structurally not equipped to step outside their functions. Their identities are too narrow. Their professional commitments are too deep. The exits from their roles do not appear to them as exits at all. They appear as cliffs. This is the disposition that the current Hofstaat shares with Eichmann's generation. The point is not that they are committing equivalent crimes. They are not, and the analogy at that level would be both wrong and disrespectful to the historical record. The point is that they share the structural feature that makes exit impossible. Their identities have collapsed into their functions. Besant is not a man who happens to be Treasury Secretary. He is, in his own self-conception by May 2026, the Treasury Secretary, and there is little left of the man before that role. The same applies to Hegseth, to Warsh, to Vance, to the dozen senior officials whose names rotate through the news cycle. When the function disappears, the identity collapses. Most of the people in this position cannot imagine the collapse. They imagine the function continuing forever, because the alternative is unimaginable. The Eichmann case adds a dimension that the Watergate case does not capture. Watergate was about consequences. Eichmann was about identity. The current Hofstaat is exposed to both. Each member faces consequences if the regime ends. Each member also faces an identity collapse if the function ends. The two reinforce each other. The consequences make the identity feel necessary. The identity makes the consequences feel acceptable. Case Study 3: Berlusconi's Court and the Conditional Lifeline. In November 2011, Silvio Berlusconi resigned as Prime Minister of Italy. He had governed for the better part of 17 years, with interruptions, and during that time had built a political coalition characterized by a specific feature that distinguished it from most contemporary democracies. A substantial portion of his cabinet, his parliamentary delegation, and his immediate political circle was personally exposed to criminal investigation, and the only thing standing between them and active prosecution was the parliamentary immunity conferred by their offices. This was not subtle. It was the explicit operating principle of Berlusconi's coalition for 2 decades. The figures involved, Cesare Previti, Marcello Dell'Utri, dozens of others, had pending or paused investigations into corruption, mafia association, false accounting, tax fraud, judicial bribery. Berlusconi himself was the largest defendant in the system, with cases stretching back to the 1980s. The mechanism was elegant, in a darkly Italian way. Parliamentary immunity, codified in Article 68 of the 1948 Constitution, prevented arrest or prosecution of legislators for actions taken in their official capacity, with extension by interpretation to many activities that were arguably non-official. Cabinet positions, governorships, and senior public posts conferred similar de facto protections through prosecutorial discretion and statutes of limitation. As long as Berlusconi's coalition retained power, the protections held. The moment the coalition lost power, the protections evaporated. This is what happened after November 2011. Within 36 months, dozens of cases that had been frozen, delayed, or paused under Berlusconi-era prosecutorial discretion were reactivated. Cesare Previti was sentenced to 6 years for judicial bribery. The sentence was upheld through appeals. Marcello Dell'Utri was sentenced to 7 years for mafia association. That sentence was also upheld. Berlusconi himself was convicted of tax fraud, the Court of Cassation confirming the verdict in 2013. Of the 4-year sentence, 3 years were automatically pardoned, and the remainder served as community service because of his age, and he was barred from public office until his eligibility was restored in 2018. The lesson the Berlusconi coalition learned in retrospect was that the entire system had operated as a kind of collective hostage situation in which the hostages were also the captors. The only way to keep the protection was to keep the power. The only way to keep the power was to do whatever was necessary, including increasingly illegal things, to retain it. The mechanism produced an escalating dynamic that no individual member of the coalition could exit, because exit meant the loss of the protection that was the entire point of membership. The American Hofstaat shares the basic logic, with American legal modifications. United States federal officials do not have parliamentary immunity in the Italian sense. They do, however, benefit from prosecutorial discretion, from the practical difficulty of investigating sitting officials, and from the legal doctrine of qualified immunity for civil suits. These protections are conditional on remaining in or near office. They evaporate in significant measure when officials leave office to private life, particularly when the administration that protected them is replaced by an administration that has political incentives to investigate. The Berlusconi case is a useful corrective for the assumption that authoritarian collapse is dramatic. Berlusconi did not fall to a coup. He fell to a financial crisis combined with electoral exhaustion and a constitutional procedure. The process took 15 months. The consequences for his coalition unfolded over the next decade. The Italian model is the slow-motion preview of what an end-of-regime exposure cascade looks like for the operators of a personalist administration that has used state office as a shield against private legal liability. Case Study 4: Kirchnerism and the Verdict That Came. In December 2022, after a trial covering the award of public roadworks contracts in the province of Santa Cruz, the Argentine Federal Oral Court No. 2 sentenced Cristina Fernández de Kirchner to 6 years in prison and to perpetual disqualification from holding public office. A federal appeals court upheld the conviction in November 2024. In June 2025, the Supreme Court confirmed it, making the sentence definitive and the ban permanent. Because she is past 70, she serves it under house arrest. Kirchner is 73 and has spent her adult life as one of the most powerful figures in Argentine politics, president for the 8 years from 2007 to 2015. She is now a convicted felon, caught by the institutions she once commanded. The Kirchnerist coalition that surrounded her, Guado de Pedro, Aníbal Fernández, Sergio Massa, Dozens of senior officials and provincial governors has spent the period since the verdict watching the implications cascade through the structure they built. Some of these officials face their own pending investigations, others face civil suits, others face career destruction even in the absence of formal proceedings, because the political coalition that conferred their relevance has fragmented, and the institutional sponsors that would normally absorb politically damaged officials are unwilling to do so. The Argentine case is instructive because it occurred under a constitutional democracy, not an authoritarian transition. Cristina Kirchner served 2 terms as president. She was vice president from 2019 to 2023. The Argentine state remained intact throughout. The institutional mechanisms that produced her conviction, the federal courts, the prosecutorial system, the appeals process, were the same mechanisms that had operated during her tenure. The institutions did not turn on her. The institutions caught up with her. The mechanism was time. Argentine courts move slowly. The Vialidad case, which produced the December 2022 verdict, was opened in 2008. Indictments filed in 2016. Trial began in 2019. Verdict in 2022. 14 years from the opening of the investigation to the conviction, and 17 to the Supreme Court's final word in 2025. Throughout that period, Kirchner exercised varying degrees of political power that affected the speed of the proceedings. The proceedings continued anyway, at the pace the courts could maintain, with the personnel the courts had available under the procedures the law required. The American Hofstaat is exposed to the same dynamic with an additional accelerant. American federal courts move faster than Argentine ones. The American media environment is more aggressive. The American civil litigation infrastructure is more developed. The American whistleblower protection statutes are more robust. The factors that contained the speed of Argentine prosecutions are weaker in the United States. The lesson Kirchnerism teaches is that the verdict comes whether or not anyone wants it to. The institutions of a democratic state, even under significant political pressure, retain enough operational capacity to produce indictments, trials, and sentences over a decade-plus timeline. The personalist coalition that imagined itself permanently in power discovered that it was permanently in court instead. Case Study 5. The American Hofstaat. By May 2026, the American senior administration has accumulated a roster of personal exposure that exceeds in scope anything seen in modern American political history. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has publicly attacked the Federal Reserve's institutional independence in a manner that has produced market reactions inconsistent with his public statements about market stability. His statements concerning Chinese vessels in the Strait of Hormuz on the same day that a Chinese-flagged tanker completed such a transit are, on their face, false. The intent question is open. The fact question is not. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has publicly endorsed a Truth Social post containing operational instructions for a maritime interdiction. The endorsement was reposted by official Defense Department accounts. The Uniform Code of Military Justice contains provisions on unlawful orders. The applicability of these provisions to a senior civilian official is contested, but it is not foreclosed. 12 senior generals were dismissed in a single day, including officers who had publicly expressed reservations about the legality of the Iran campaign. Documentation has emerged that the dismissal justifications were drafted after the dismissals, not before. Whistleblower protection statutes apply to such situations. Civil suits by the dismissed officers are foreseeable. The Attorney General was dismissed before her scheduled testimony in the Epstein matter. The replacement has overseen a reorganization of the department's internal review procedures that has been characterized by senior career attorneys as inconsistent with the department's regulations. Multiple Inspector General complaints have been filed. The renaming of the United States Institute of Peace and the use of the John F. Kennedy Center as a personal monument to a sitting president are subject to civil suits. The defendants in those suits include individual officials by name. The Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act of 2004 governs the Federal Recreation Pass program and frames any challenge to the National Park Pass redesign. The Thayer Amendment of 1866 bars the likeness of any living person from United States currency and securities, whether it reaches a commemorative coin, which the statute does not expressly cover, is untested. This is not a moral inventory. It is a litigation map. Each of the items above represents a specific legal vulnerability for one or more named individuals. Each can be pursued by one or more parties with standing. Each will take months or years to process. None will become less viable with time. The senior officials of the current administration know this. They have access to legal counsel. They are not unaware of the doctrine of qualified immunity, the operation of statutes of limitation, the procedures of federal civil discovery. What they have done, individually and collectively, is calculate that the political success of the administration will provide a sustainable shield against the legal exposure they have each accumulated. The calculation depends on permanent political success. This is the structural feature. The shield is conditional. The conditional has not been guaranteed, and every additional act of public commitment to the regime narrows the available exits. Why the system hardens. The implications of universal lock-in among senior officials are not symmetrical with the implications of normal political coalition. In a normal coalition, the operators have political incentives to support the leader and personal incentives to retain options. The two pressures balance. When a leader's policies become unpopular or unsuccessful, the operators recalibrate. Some defect, others negotiate a quiet exit, and the political system absorbs the change as part of normal democratic dynamics. In a lock-in coalition, the personal incentives no longer balance the political ones. They reinforce them. An operator who has crossed all three thresholds cannot afford to recalibrate, because recalibration implies the possibility of an exit, and the exits have closed. The operator's only remaining strategy is to make the regime succeed. If the regime succeeds, the protections continue. If the regime fails, the consequences arrive. There is no third outcome. This produces a specific behavioral signature. The operators of a lock-in coalition will, at every decision point, choose the option that maximizes the probability of regime continuation, even when that option is suboptimal for any other purpose. They will not consider the option that exposes them to retreat. They will not consider the option that admits past error. They will not consider the option that requires institutional reform. They will not consider the option that distributes the risk beyond themselves. The dynamic is amplified by two well-worn features of how people weigh loss. Sunk costs exert their own gravitation. Each act already committed creates pressure to commit further, because retreat would render the prior commitments meaningless. And the asymmetry of loss aversion makes the prospect of acknowledging error more painful than the prospect of incurring additional risk. The combination ensures that the operators will, in aggregate, escalate rather than de-escalate when the regime's position deteriorates. The reaction to setback is doubling down, not stepping back. The next 18 months can be read across a range of outcomes. The base case is hardening of policy across all major categories. The operators will not recommend de-escalation in Iran, because de-escalation implies acknowledgement of failure. They will not recommend reduction of the executive's political profile, because reduction implies that the profile was a problem. They will not recommend negotiated transitions of any kind. They will recommend, at every juncture, doubling down. The midterm elections of November 2026 are the first major test, and the operators have personal stakes in the outcome that exceed any operator's personal stakes in normal American electoral cycles. The worst case is the recognition by the operators that even continuous regime success may not save them, and the resulting decision to forego the appearance of constitutional limits altogether. This is the path that Berlusconi did not take, that Kirchner could not take, and that the American senior administration is structurally positioned to consider. The trigger in such scenarios is rarely a strategic decision. It is a moment of panic, a polling shift, an unfavorable court ruling, a defection, a market shock. The system that has no exits prefers no rules to no power. The best case is that some senior operator, sufficiently early, recognizes the closing window and walks through the John Dean door. The window is narrow. The historical base rate for such walks is low, but the window has not yet fully closed. A single defection at the right moment can shift the calculus for several other officials simultaneously, because each operator's position is influenced by the visible behavior of peers. The chain that compliance built can be unbuilt by a single visible refusal. If it comes at the moment, the others are already privately calculating. The base case prevails in the absence of any individual choosing the best case. The probability distribution favors the base case strongly. It does not foreclose the others. The thesis is falsifiable on a defined horizon. If, before the November 2026 midterms, and while the prosecutorial framework is still incomplete, a cabinet-level official resigns and cooperates against the regime, and the administration responds by de-escalating rather than escalating, then the lock-in described here does not hold, and this essay is wrong. The prediction runs the other way. No such defection and escalation at each setback. The 10th man. The argument above admits 4 serious counterpositions, each worth examining. First counter, the operators do have exits. The Trump-aligned economy is now substantial, with Truth Social, conservative media, MAGA-aligned investment vehicles, and a sympathetic judicial bench providing landing places for officials whose mainstream careers are foreclosed. Mike Pompeo has consulted profitably, and Hegseth himself returned to Fox News after Trump 1.0. The model exists and provides post-government income. The response: the model exists for officials whose exposure is reputational only. It does not exist for officials whose exposure is criminal. A senior official under federal indictment cannot return to Fox News in a meaningful capacity. A federal judgment in a civil rights case cannot be discharged by a pivot to MAGA-aligned podcasting. The Trump-aligned economy provides exits for the first threshold. It does not provide exits for the second or third. Second counter, Trump 1.0 ended with very few prosecutions of senior officials. Manafort, Gates, Stone, and Cohen were prosecuted, but most of the senior coalition, Tillerson, McMaster, Mattis, Pompeo, emerged without significant legal consequence. The base rate for prosecution of former senior officials is low. Why assume Trump 2.0 will be different? The response: the volume and visibility of irreversible acts is significantly higher in Trump 2.0 than in Trump 1.0, and the political coalition opposing the administration has had 8 years to develop its prosecutorial framework. The base rate is not constant. It rises with documentation. The current administration has produced more documented exposure in 15 months than the prior administration produced in 4 years. The prosecution rate need not match historical averages to produce material consequences for several senior officials. Third counter: lock-in could be a strength. A coordinated coalition with no available defections is harder to break than a coalition full of officials with quiet exits. The mechanism that traps the operators in the regime also binds them to its success. This is why personalist regimes often prove more resilient in the short term than their institutional alternatives. The response: this is partially correct. Short-term resilience is real. Personalist regimes can extend their grip beyond what institutional analysis predicts, precisely because their operators have no quiet exits. But the same dynamic produces fragility on the other side. A regime whose operators cannot defect is a regime whose internal information channels are corrupted, because honest information would imply the possibility of defection. The same lock-in that produces short-term cohesion produces long-term blindness. Compound ignorance, the first essay in this trilogy, is the consequence. Fourth counter: the historical analogies are inappropriate. Berlusconi operated in a legal system with weaker rule of law guarantees than the United States. Kirchner operated in a state with substantially less institutional resilience. Eichmann operated in a regime that ended in foreign military occupation. None of these cases maps cleanly onto an American constitutional democracy with functioning courts, robust civil society, and a tradition of peaceful transition. The response: the analogies are not arguments by identity, but by mechanism. The mechanism in each case is the same. Officials whose personal exposure is conditional on continued political power develop an interest in retaining political power that exceeds any legitimate institutional interest. The legal context modifies the timeline and the form of the exposure. It does not eliminate the structural dynamic. American officials have access to better legal protection than their Italian or Argentine counterparts, but they are also subject to a more aggressive prosecutorial system, a more developed civil litigation infrastructure, and a press environment that documents in real time what previous regimes managed to obscure for decades. The American case may be slower in onset and faster in resolution. It is not fundamentally different in mechanism. None of these counterpositions overturns the core argument. They constrain its scope. The lock-in dynamic is real but not absolute. Some officials will find genuine exits. Some prosecutions will fail. Some lock-ins will produce short-term cohesion that delays the eventual collapse. The base case still prevails. The senior officials of a lock-in coalition cannot, in aggregate, walk back. But the distribution around that base case is wider than the simple version of the argument allows. Some individuals will walk back successfully. Most will not. Epilogue: the trilogy and the turn. This essay completes the opening trilogy of the State of the Republic series. The first essay described compound ignorance, the leader who has stopped reading, and the consequences of his withdrawal from the world of evidence. The second turned to obedience in advance, the courtiers who bring him only what he wishes to hear, signed and ready before being asked. This third has described why the courtiers cannot stop bringing. The leader himself, his psychology and the signature he writes on his own record, is the subject of a companion piece, the signature that signed its own obituary. The three essays describe a single mechanism with three faces. The leader is uninformed because the courtiers filter his information. The courtiers filter his information because they have anticipated what he wants. They have anticipated what he wants because the alternative is exit. An exit is no longer possible for them. They have foreclosed their own exits because each act of compliance has compounded into a personal exposure that only continued compliance can defer. The mechanism is self-sealing. It is also self-accelerating. Each turn of the cycle produces more compliance, more exposure, less information, and more incentive to seal the system further against the corrective pressures that would normally restore it to function. The system cannot reform itself because reformation would require some operator to walk through the door that has been closing behind them. The corrective pressure must therefore come from outside the lock-in coalition. It cannot come from a senior operator's private recalculation. It cannot come from internal informational shifts. It must come from external mechanisms that the lock-in coalition cannot suppress. The press, the courts, the markets, the electorate, the international system, and, eventually, sometimes too late, the historical record. The Republic is what those external pressures produce when they are organized. It exists not as a state, but as a practice. Every external pressure that holds is a small refusal of the lock-in. Every external pressure that yields is a confirmation of it. The arithmetic is daily, distributed, partially visible, and decisive. The court will not disband. It cannot. The court can only be disbanded. Whether that disbandment occurs through institutional discipline, through political defeat, through judicial process, or through historical reckoning, is the question that the next year and a half will answer. None of the answers is certain. None of the futures is guaranteed. The court is locked in. The Republic is not yet. That was Janus Dispatch. Sources, charts, and disclosure are in the published post. Next in the State of the Republic series turns from the operators to the believers. If the court is locked in, and the correction must come from outside, the next question is why the people who could supply that pressure do not, why facts, once held, so rarely move the holder. Same architecture, the other side of the chain. If this dispatch sharpened your read, subscribe so the next one lands in your inbox. Janus Dispatch is at janusthewatcher.substack.com. The long arguments are in the books. The transition sequence, 2 volumes, 1 thesis. The ground is shifting. Book 1, The Proto-Post-National Age. Book 2, The Frame, available on Amazon, paperback, and Kindle. The dispatches connect. The books carry the weight. Architecture over narrative.